make sure that that sounded okay to everybody. If it doesn't, you can either throw something at me or go. Either way, it doesn't matter. But I think it'll be good. So Megan, you want to get started?
Sure. I recommend is doing best practices for data journalism and making sure that you're doing an accurate story is you have to start before you ever request your data. It really starts from the very, very beginning. So I know this seems simple, but a lot of people skip this step, is doing your research. So before you request a database, find out, all right, what are the form names, the program names, what steps have to be done. So for example, if you were looking at a social program and you wanted to know, what data the government keeps, I call it channel your inner whatever. So we have a welfare program that we deal with that I did investigation into with food stamps. And so I wanted to see the vendors, the businesses, the retailers, the grocery stores, the data on that. And so I channeled my inner grocery store owner and said, all right, what data do I have to give the government that I know the government keeps? And then that allows me as the journalist to request, and I know this is exactly what the government is doing and the data it's keeping. So look at those forms, those program names. Befriend the IT folks, the people who are actually dealing with the data clerks. These are the people that really know what's going on versus the spokespeople that you deal with. And also they can tell you the caveats or the bad parts of the data that you need to worry about. I've also, people talk about source development. I recommend source development with these IT folks. I had a great relationship when I was working at a newspaper where the IT person would send me data and I wouldn't even have to file an open records request because we established that relationship. So make sure to get to know the data clerks and the IT people. The other thing to do is check online. Is there a searchable database online or is the data online? But the one thing I'd tell you is don't be comfortable just getting that online data because there may be columns of data or fields of information that's not online that's actually publicly available. So use that online data as an example, but make sure you get all the columns and fields of data from the entire database and doing that for requesting. Before I ever request a database, I always made a phone call, especially if you're dealing with a government official or someone who works an employee who isn't used to journalists asking for data. Nothing freaks them out more if you've never asked for data and all of a sudden you're asking questions of, hey, I want this massive database. So I always give them a phone call for one, to kind of prepare them. Hey, I'm going to email you this request for data. But two, I also make sure, are you the person I'm supposed to send it to? Is this what the data is called or what format is? And sometimes they'll be helpful, sometimes they're not, but it's worth kind of asking the question. When you're doing that online research, I recommend searching for manuals, like data manuals. So there's a lot of data manuals floating out there that are supposed to usually be used internally, but they can be on the web that you can kind of do an advanced search. So this is from the official Norway Nature Index database. And what this manual is for the users who are actually inputting the data. So what's helpful with this manual, it's 39 pages, so you don't have to read it all, but it will tell you what data they're collecting and how they're reporting it and how they're collecting it. So by reading this manual that's floating out on the web, you can actually find out what information they're collecting, and that will help you write your response and get the information you're looking for. PowerPoint presentations are super helpful too, and those are kind of floating out. I did an advanced search for PPT. This is from Environmental Affairs from the South African government, and they talk about the data that they're collecting on rhino poaching. So I know, all right, there's data that they're referencing here, they're showing stats. I know that I can reference this to get the database behind there. So it kind of shows you information that they're collecting, and PowerPoints can be really helpful at getting that information.
The way Megan was mentioning that she found that is you can do a Google, you can use Google and do, you want to show just super quick? One way to find PowerPoints or data that's online is to do a Google advanced search and search for a certain kind of file, which Megan will show you real quick. So it's a good way to search for data online just to see what's out there that a government agency or somebody else might have. You can also search for PowerPoints the same way. So you can search for both file type and you can do what they call a domain search, which means whatever the end of your government's web name is. It disappeared.
Oh.
It's up there now, right?
Yeah. Minimize it maybe? Is it too large?
No, I don't know.
Okay.
Okay, I see the problem, right.
Okay.
So the idea, though, is that you can search for both the domain, which is whatever your government's domain has to be, something.gov or whatever it might be, and then you can search by file type, and that lets you look on their website for certain types of files, whether they're data, whether they're PowerPoints, and it's a really, really good way to figure out what an agency keeps online, and to also look, as Megan was saying, for PowerPoint files or other things which could give you a clue as to what they've got.
Yeah, so there's you can narrow your search results. This is really cutting it off. Narrow your search results. So you could do a specific site or domain, or like I did for the South American government, .za. And then you can do the file type. And you can change it to any file type. They have a drop-down menu. But here's where you could do PDF, you can do Excel, and then you can also do PowerPoints. And then if you want a different file type that's not listed in there, or you want to change the site or domain, you can just change it right here if you want like a text file or something like that.
And I'll just mention quickly, it's not really what we're here to talk about today, but we have a handout on doing all this stuff. And if anybody wants that, I'll just give you my email address real quick, and if you email me, we'll just zap that to you. My email is just mark, M-A-R-K, @ire.org. That's mark @ire.org. And Megan's is the same, except with Megan instead of Mark.
Yeah, so MEGAN is how you spell my name, @ire.org. And our job for IRE is to help you all, so definitely feel free to email us. So when you're filing your request, and this will help you kind of bulletproof and make sure you're getting exactly what you want to do an accurate story, we recommend doing at least 3 years, because you really can't tell a trend. If your results, if you're getting crime data and you see that there's 1,000 murders, is that a big number or a small number? And you have to put that number into context. So you can barely tell that with 3 years of data. I say 3 years is good, 5 is better, all is best. So if you're going to if you want to tell, your story can be much bigger if you're saying this is the most number of murders in a 10-year period versus this is more than last year, right? So I'd put an asterisk if you're taking notes about all. When you request all the data, and this is why you make a phone call, you want to make sure that the reporting standards haven't changed. And what I mean by reporting standards is going back to crime data. Maybe you have this crime data and you see from 2013 to 2014 there's been an increase in the number of rapes. And you think you have a story. Come to find out, they changed the reporting standard, the way they report it, and they combined sodomy and other rapes together into one category. That's why the rape category increased. So it's really important to make sure that they're reporting the data and they're entering the data at the same time every year if you're going to compare year to year. And usually things do change, so it's important to ask when you make that phone call. So think of kind of a time frame that will read well, that you can write well. I tend to see people will do like half a year and then a year here, and it's hard to write around that, I think. So it's much easier to say in the last 5 years instead of saying in the last 14 months. But of course you can write around it. But think about how you're going to report this and how your graphics people will appreciate it, or your editors or your producers when you air it. What's going to sound more conversational when you're requesting years. I list, and it depends on the open records laws that you guys deal with, and I know some of you don't have open records laws, but I actually list out every single item. When I did that research and get those blank forms that people are filling out where the data I'm looking for, I list every single item that those vendors or those grocery store owners are filling out, and I list that in my request. It seems really annoying and detailed, but for some governments you have to do that, otherwise they're not going to give you all the data. So I list all those columns of data that I'm requesting, and then I say, but not limited to, because there may be other columns that aren't on that form that they're keeping in that database. Other things you want to ask for are code sheets. A lot of data is coded, and if you don't ask for those code sheets, you won't be able to understand what the data actually says. So this is an accident database code sheet, and it's super detailed. Hopefully the internet hasn't kicked me off yet. But it's super detailed that tells you the type of automobile or a train that's involved. And we'll see if this will pull up. We'll come back to it. The other thing you want to ask, and I do this all in the same request, is I ask for record layout. We call record layout kind of like your roadmap. And it tells you, all right, the first column of data has the record type, and it's 1 digit long. The second column is return year. The third column is the national ID. So it's really helpful, because sometimes you'll get data. Have you guys ever had this? You've gotten data and there's no column headers or column names, so you're not sure what you're dealing with. So it's really important to have the record layout. And here's kind of a code sheet of auto accidents that you can get to. Wording is key. Sometimes government officials are very literal, and if you don't ask for it, they're not going to give it to you. When I ask for data, I get all of the data, so I ask for all the fields because you never know what you might be missing. One of my mentors tells a great story of how she requested some federal contract data, and in one column it was the dollar amount, and then the next column was negative or positive. So if she didn't get all the fields of data and she just got a dollar amount, she wouldn't know whether it was a negative amount or a positive amount, and her story would be completely off. So I make sure getting all the data fields because you never know what's going to be in that database instead of listing just 1 or 2 or 3 fields that you think you only want for your story. And there's a lot of data available in other countries that you can kind of pull from.
Yeah, and in fact, that's another area that if any of you are interested, we have handouts that would be more than happy to share with you. But there's many of you are from countries that may not be that free with their own data, or sometimes even if they are, they don't necessarily keep good data for comparison purposes. So there are organizations like the UN, the World Bank, even the U.S. government has lots of good data on other countries. And so that data has been used many, many times all over the world for various stories that allow you to do comparisons. So again, if you're interested in that, let us know and we can get you something which will give you some links and things to some of those sites.
And some countries don't require you to be a resident of that country, so you could also file an open records request. For those, if the data that Mark's talking about isn't on there, you can request from another country.
And a lot of this stuff is online. In this case, much of that data is available without asking and making any requests whatsoever.
So you have your data. You got it, hopefully. Yay. A couple things to do before you start doing calculations and doing pivot tables and queries. One thing we recommend is making a copy. So you, like in my computer, I would have a file for original and I'd have a file for working. And I'd only do my analysis on the working. Because we're human beings, we make mistakes. I may accidentally delete something or missort it. So it's always helpful to have a clean, untouched copy of your data just in case you do make mistakes and only do your analysis on that working. We do something called the 4 corners test, which allows you to basically check the 4 corners. On your PC, it's just Control and then using your arrow keys. I believe it's Command on the Mac. So it allows you to go all the way to the right, all the way to the bottom, to the left, to make sure, all right, what data I have. It seems like a silly thing to do, but I've gotten data where I'm looking at the Excel spreadsheet and it looks like my data ends in column M. But because there's there's several blank columns after that. But actually, if you scroll over, they forgot to delete column X, Y, and Z. And so there may be some random columns of data in there.
Yeah, can I make one other thing I would do? Always look for 2 other things. When you get if you either download or someone emails you a spreadsheet or any sort of electronic database, look at the columns and look to see if anything's missing. Sometimes I've had this happen more than once getting data. They were trying to not give me certain columns. Instead of deleting them, they just hid them, but they're still there. So when you unhide them, you can get all sorts of information. The other thing to look for is the tabs across the bottom. I've had organizations before, and I once sent something I didn't mean to send to somebody because it was on another tab and I forgot to delete it. So always look immediately when you get data. Make sure there aren't any columns or fields, and read every single tab super carefully to see if maybe you got something you weren't supposed to get.
We also recommend checking the math. Do not trust anyone else's calculations. So if there's any totals on there, sums, averages, you want to definitely redo that analysis and check the math. The other thing I'd recommend, because this is important if any of you guys are doing counts or group bys in SQL, or you're doing pivot tables and you're doing counts, is to know what each line represents. And it's really important on the onset to figure that out. So for example, this is armed conflict data from countries in Africa. And so in this case, 1 line equals 1 conflict. So other examples are if you get salary data, you may have 1 line equals 1 employee's weekly paycheck. So an employee's name will be in there 52 times. In this case, we know that 1 event's only going to be in there once, so it's easier to find duplicates. And when you're doing your counts, you know what you're actually counting.
Yeah, so another thing I would always try to do, especially if you're getting the data from an organization, make sure you know how many rows there are supposed to be. That you're supposed to be getting 763 rows or whatever it is, and then make sure you actually have that many. That's really important. It's one of the most important things to check. And as Megan was mentioning earlier, if you get that record layout in advance, you also know how many columns there are supposed to be. oftentimes they'll send you data and only give you certain pieces and not tell you. So to know what's missing, you have to know the entire universe of what was supposed to be there in the first place. One other thing that can be important about knowing what columns exist before you ask for data, if you're going to do that, is that in many countries like the US, some data is public and some data just is not. There's personal information that we cannot get on, say, government employees. Or if we're asking for information from schools, there's information on students that we don't have a right to get under the law. So if you know that's in the data, you can sort of preemptively say, I'd like this data set, but not the following. And it allows you to remove that excuse from them by saying, I'm not asking for these things that I'm not allowed to have. Let's see. Yeah, data consistency. And what all that means is you're looking to make sure that that the data has been entered consistently the same way. For example, right now we're entering election season in the U.S., and so campaign donations, as they are in many places, are public. And so the problem is if you just get a data set of donations, let's say that I was running for office, because I would make a good something. I would. So I get donations from Megan, right? But the donations from Megan, she gives donations to me 3 times because I'm her employer and I'll fire her if she doesn't. And so one donation is from Megan Luther. One donation is from Mrs. Megan Luther. One donation is from M. Luther. And they're all the same address, but the spreadsheet, when I try to put those together, won't put them together. It will think she's 3 different people, and I won't get accurate totals for how much she's given me. And you might think this is an obvious thing to notice, but I promise you it's not. As a very quick example, we do data boot camps at IRE where journalists come actually from all over the world to learn how to do this stuff. And we had somebody from a big U.S. organization that's very well respected that during campaign season puts out campaign donation information that everybody uses, right? Very trusted organization. And we had one of the junior people from there who came to learn how to do this stuff. And so during an open session of the lab, this junior person had taken their own data, and she was trying to replicate what they'd done already so she could just make sure she understood how to do it. And she was getting a result that was $500,000 US wrong. And she couldn't figure out what she was doing wrong. And so she asked me to sit down with her, and I watched. And it turned out that she was doing it exactly right, and that their organization had missed a $500,000 donation from because it was like a Mrs. somebody instead of her first name. So their entire list on the website that people had been citing for weeks, if not months, about the top donors to a candidate was wrong, right? So it's easy to make these mistakes, even for very, very, very good journalists. You also want to look for blank cells, because sometimes that means that information is missing. So one easy way to do that is just to sort by column, which puts all the blanks either at the top or the bottom. And then that way you know if information's missing in certain columns. Sometimes there's not supposed to be anything there, and that's all right. But if you have missing information and you try to total those columns up, the problem is that at the end of the day you get a dollar amount which is not the right amount or a count which is not right. And the last thing, and this is just super important even though it's super obvious, is never assume anything about anything. It's the worst mistake journalists can make in anything. But with data, it can be particularly dangerous. You know, go in with a blank slate and let the data tell you what's there. If you assume that you're going to find a certain kind of trend or you're looking for certain things, oftentimes you'll only do the searches and the things that are going to reinforce what you believe, as opposed to using the data to look for the things that might not. It's the same thing you do when you're reporting any story. It's just as important to try to disprove what you know as to prove it, and it's the same thing with the data.
So while you're doing your analysis, log your work. I'm assuming a lot of you, correct me if I'm wrong, have to do other stories, and you have to balance between your data analysis and your stories. So sometimes we get busy, a source finally calls us back, we have to go cover breaking news. It's really important to log your work so you know where you stopped or finished off. So that's everything from if you're using Excel, talking about, okay, imported this, I changed this column, I cleaned this up, to if you're using SQL, I would copy and paste my SQL statements, my language statements, my query statements into a Word document so I knew exactly what I did with that data. I recommend not saving pivot tables if you're using Excel. One, Excel doesn't like it. It takes a lot of energy for your computer. But two, you should be able to get your finding and say, all right, this person has the most campaign donations. I'll write their name down and then move on. Because we're going to talk about it, but you're going to want to duplicate your results later on instead of just looking at the same pivot table. Same thing with queries and access or views if you're using SQLite. Saving your findings, I recommend writing it down like you're taking notes like you're a reporter. It will help with your writing, and writing it out will help you remember how to qualify it instead of just saying, Megan Luther, $5,000. You know exactly what that means, in the last 10 years to candidate XYZ. Create memos. So if you're coming from a newsroom or you work for someone, an editor, a producer, news director who's not used to data analysis, if you just show them a spreadsheet or just show them like an Access database, they're going to freak out or they can't see the story. So I recommend creating memos, explaining to them like you would explain to a reader or a viewer or a listener, here's what the data says and here's the cool stories we can do with this data. It also helps you form your data story because sometimes I think we get into the weeds when we do data analysis and we're only looking at the stats, and the data is only a minor part of your story. I mean, you have the rest of the reporting to do. So creating a memo can help you get the creative side of our brain, the writing side of our brain, getting those juices flowing. I always like to create an Excel to-do list, not only to do the analysis I have to do in the data, but then what I need to do after that to support the story or to finish my story out. Keep a running list of questions for IT data folks. When I was a reporter and I got database, I would mess with it for at least a week. And then you find the caveats, you find the problems, you find the missing data. And then I tried not to bug the data clerks and the IT people too much because they're doing me a favor. So I would have a running list, and then I'd send all the problems that I found or all the questions I have to the data clerks, the IT people, to bug them to find out what's going on. Create lists. So it was helpful for me when I was analyzing data to create lists of, for example, if I'm doing a story on dilapidated, rundown properties, I would create a list of 10 properties that my photographers or my videographers, when they're working throughout the week, hey, I'm in this neighborhood, I can get video or a picture of this because I know it's going to be used in a data story. And it's nice, it's important to, people tend to bring in the photographers, graphic designers, web people on at the tail end after you're finished with your story. It is much better to bring them in when you're doing the data analysis and you're talking about the formation of your story. One, it makes them feel better that they're not left out, but two, you will find that it will help with it will help you construct a better investigation. So I recommend getting those people meeting on the beginning of the project versus the end. And this goes to your presentation should not be an afterthought. No one's going to read it. No one's going to listen or watch your investigation if you don't have a great presentation to grab their attention, especially now with so many other options for people to look at. So I recommend kind of checking your analysis. So if you're doing Excel and you're doing pivot tables, I always recommend doing, if you did a pivot table and you found that someone had the most donations, I would go back and do a filter on contains or do a keyword filter to make sure that there isn't a Mrs. Megan Luther and just a Megan Luther. And this goes back to what Mark was saying. You want to make sure, because in pivot tables, for those who are familiar with pivot tables, and data in general, when you're doing analysis, M. Luther is a completely different person than Megan Luther. So doing that filter on keywords can kind of help with that. I also recommend when you're doing your analysis not to use notes. You should be able to use a different method, whether it's filter or pivot table in Excel, or use a different query or an SQL statement in Access or Database Manager and get the same result if you're doing it correctly. So you should be able to replicate those results. I would spot check the data you're working on with the original. So remember I talked about making a copy of your data? So I would take my working file and do a sample size of rows and make sure that those rows match up. Megan Luther, January 1st, 2013, $5,000 donation to Mark Horvit. And that everything lines up in the original so that I didn't mess up my data, and do a sample of that. So I would check. What I used to do when I was in TV, I'd print out my script for my executive producer and print when I gave it to the editor. I would print out my story and I would highlight every single sentence, whether it was a number or whether it was a statement that came from my own data analysis. I then replicated my analysis. For me, I felt comfortable I did it 3 times. And I wanted to make sure I got the exact same answer 3 times. And I did that without notes. You should be able to go back to your data, whether you do it a different SQL statement or a different way, and get the same results. So for me, 3 times was kind of made me feel better. But people usually assume, well, I just have to check a number. And sometimes people just look up a previous pivot table they did. You should be redoing the analysis, I think, in order to sleep better at night. and actually redoing the analysis, not looking at your notes. Review your logs. Make sure that you didn't misclean something or do a misstep. And then have someone else check. Whether it's someone in your newsroom who's familiar with Excel or SQL, I've had reporters send me their data to make sure, all right, am I doing this right? Am I looking at it right? And I always recommend if you're going to have someone check your analysis, whether it's an editor or someone in your newsroom, send them the data and the questions you're asking the data. Do not send them the answer. Because sometimes people's egos get in the way, or they're worried, oh, I got a different answer than what my boss got. Do I really want to tell him I got a different answer? Mine's probably wrong. So I recommend sending the questions that you want to ask the data and the data itself for people to check your analysis. So data is not the full story. There's several things you have to do after you have your data, after you do your data analysis. We recommend sharing it with officials. One, just to make sure you're doing it right. A good, humble thing that happened with me is I received warrant data for our county, the sheriff warrant data, people who had arrests for their warrant. And I kept getting people with multiple first DUIs. And I'm thinking, well, you can only get a first DUI once, because then you get your second, or not me, but you get your second. And DUI is driving under the influence, so driving while drinking. And so I thought that they had messed up the data. And so I went to officials and said, I think you guys have messed up this data. And they're like, come to find out, it was a better story because they were having the worst drunks, people who were getting multiple drinking while driving arrests, were getting them so close together that they hadn't been judged by their first one. So they were actually escaping prison time because they were getting 5 to 6 to 7 first DUIs and then getting just a slap on the wrist. So share with officials just to make sure you're not doing it, you're not looking at the data wrong. And then also your targets, or subjects that you're doing the analysis. We did some analysis on an ethanol plant, a manufacturing plant, and I wanted to make sure that they had the same results. And what's helpful is when they don't deny your results, it can make your reporting a lot more aggressive and your investigation a lot more aggressive. They may try to spin them, but it makes you feel better knowing that you have the same data results. Pull reports and documents, and this goes back to what Mark was saying. There's a lot of times, especially if you're dealing with budgets, there'll be a report on this saying this is the total number that we should have in the budget. So that total number should match with the total number that you have in your data. So there's usually reports or documents that are coming from that data that are publicly available, so make sure that matches. And then cross-check with other info. That may be info online, that might be with news releases. If you're doing a data analysis on car accidents, pull a couple car accidents to make sure the data matches what you've previously reported. And of course, you have to do the interviews as well. This is a good example of when you click on this, you can, for time's sake, I won't go to the story, but you can click on this image and go to the story. A TV station in the United States had gotten data of police officers saying that they were witnessing a speeding ticket when they weren't even in the vicinity. So they could have just used the speeding ticket data, which showed them that, hey, you can't be in two places at once, but they took it a step further to confirm their data, and they got the GPS locations of their patrol cars when the officer said they were in a different location. So make sure, sometimes it takes a second database to confirm and make you feel better about your results. A lot of it comes down to how you write your data story. In some data stories, if you say that someone was convicted 12 times, sometimes it doesn't matter if you're talking about they have the most convictions, sometimes the exact number. And there are stories, exact numbers do matter, but sometimes it's more conversational to say at least 12 times, more than a dozen times, or more than 10 times, or about. And that kind of saves you to make sure that you won't have a correction or try to avoid a correction. Let go of some gems. So what I mean by gems is sometimes you get into data analysis and you have all these stats and all these great numbers and you want to throw them all on the page. I call it vomiting numbers. So you're like vomiting numbers onto your story online or in your TV story, and your readers and listeners and viewers aren't going to read that story because it's too many numbers. So I recommend letting go of some of your gems when you're doing your data story. And putting those gems, whether in a database online or in a graphic, but make sure you let go of some of those gems. And don't overextend and don't draw conclusions. Sometimes people think this database should be able to tell me an exact answer And sometimes you have to give credit to your readers. You can't always connect the lines. So give credit to your readers and viewers that they could ask those extra questions, but you can only say so much of what the data says. Sometimes people are looking for absolute conclusions or absolute solutions or facts, and sometimes you can only say the data says X, Y, Z. So make sure you don't overextend. And of course, give yourself credit. I don't think people do this enough, but if you're doing the analysis and you're doing the hard work, make sure you say, according to XYZ online analysis of, corruption data, we found this. So it kind of helps giving credibility to what you're doing.
Okay. And then just quickly, these are some things that I would always ask myself before I went to publish with anything. First of all, what don't I know, right? That you've always got to think, that's with any story, but especially with data stories. What knowledge or information don't you have? And make sure you acknowledge that in any story that you do. Really important. I'll also always try to think about, so how could this be wrong? How could I have screwed up, right? And then, as Megan was saying earlier, check every single number you're going to use with the sources that you're writing about. I cannot overstate this enough. There is zero reason not to share your analysis with it's their data. There's no reason not to send them your spreadsheets, not to, if they're in the same location as you, to go over there, let them see your stuff. If it's good, if it's wrong, the beautiful thing about data is if they want to tell you it's wrong, they have to actually be able to show you that it's wrong. It's not the same thing as a quote or something. It's a fact. It's right or it's wrong. And I've had things, rarely if ever, but every once in a while, they'd catch something we did wrong, and I'd way rather they caught it before we published. It's way less embarrassing when it's not a correction. And then this is really, this is another place that I used to find the most problems when I was editing, is that we do data, the story would go through so many different eyeballs and people paying attention to it. Then we'd give it to a graphics artist and nobody else would look at it. And it would just be so phenomenally, awesomely wrong. We had that also happened, by the way, with a photographer thing. Once we were doing this thing about slumlords, about people who were, property owners who were treating people terribly. And we had lawyers look at the story. We were so careful. Then they did a slideshow in which they libeled every single human being you could possibly libel. They said all sorts of stuff about these people. It wasn't even right. It was actually up on the website before I caught it. So you have to remember that every single word that goes with the story that you're associated with, you're responsible for. Even if you're not the graphics artist, even if you're not the photographer, I always thought it's always on me, it's always on you. And other people just won't interpret your stuff correctly. And then the last thing, this is really important too. Sometimes you're going to get results when you do an analysis that are just so awesome, it's just too good to be true. You can't imagine how great it is. If it seems too good to be true, it probably is. So be very skeptical if you found results that fly in the face of every other result anyone's ever known. And just one super quick example of that. At my last paper, I'd fill in sometimes on the city desk, so I was putting out the paper one night, and we had a huge, the front page, 2/3 of the front page was this one story, and it was this, I don't exactly know the right way to word it, but it was this migration story. You can get this data in the U.S. you could probably do it lots of places from tax returns. You can compare tax returns from year to year to year to look at how people have moved within the country. Because every time you file a tax return, we can't get the tax returns. That's not public. But the fact that they filed their taxes is. So you can see that someone listed this address this year, that address the next year, that address the next year. And it's actually a really good way to look at patterns in the way people move within a country, right? So we were doing a story that showed everything we thought we knew was wrong about the way people moved in our community. They were moving into these areas that everybody thought were getting emptier. They'd done this big story that literally said that every demographer was wrong. And I thought, can that really be true? So I called the guy at home, asked if I could go on his computer and look at his data, and I did. And it turned out he'd made one small mistake when he was doing one sort, and all the numbers in one column had got pushed down one row. One row. And that made everything below that one number wrong. So we had 3/4 of the front page with a massive graphic that they'd spent a couple of weeks on that was completely wrong. It was actually really hard for me to get them to pull it. I mean, I finally had to just, they wanted to go with it anyway because it was pretty. And because it was 10:30 at night and it was 2/3 of the front page. This is back when front pages were still a thing and deadlines existed and all that kind of stuff. But so you've just got to make sure anytime you find results that seem really different than current knowledge, it might be the best story ever or you screwed up. And this isn't really, my voice is now changing. This isn't just for data, but I threw this in here. This is a great checklist that we did not put together, but it's a checklist for catching mistakes in stories. I used to make one of my own. I don't know how you do it, but when I would go, after I'd turn a story in when I was writing, I had my own little checklist, and I would go through every single fact, no matter what it was, and recheck it. And this is a good one that you can use if you want to, that sort of does the same thing. It reminds you of all the little details you need to check. Most of the mistakes that I made when I was writing particularly were the things that I just thought I knew, so I didn't bother checking them again. They were the little details, right? You always, if you're accusing somebody of something, you check that 16 times. But if you're just listing their address or the place where they are, you might write that once and never think about it again. And that's where I would always make mistakes. Sounds like I made a million. But when I would make them, that's usually where they were.
It's good to be honest.
Yeah,
well, the other thing, too, and you talked a little bit about this, is no person should be surprised that they're going to be in a story. And sometimes when we deal with data, we have a list of the top 10 or the top 20, and you only interviewed the top 3. Those other top 20 shouldn't be surprised that they're in this graphic or in this list. So I highly recommend you calling them and letting them know this is what we found out, and do the same thing you did with those top 3 people to make sure that what you have is accurate.
All right, so just a couple of graphics things, and most of these were slides that I stole straight up from a lightning talk that was done at our CAR conference a couple of years ago. But when you are doing data visualization, it's really important to use the right tool. Like, this is a terrible pie chart because it should technically add up to 100%. So this graphic means, and this actually ran, this means nothing, all right? So you have to think about what you're using. I like this one a lot. Now, this was intentional, but it's still messed up. This is a news organization that was trying to do a story showing about how many people were on welfare. So notice that column number 1 is 100.86 million people, but column number 2 is 101 million. It's not that different, right? But they did it, and there's no scale. Never, ever, ever do a bar chart with no scale on it. But so clearly, this was done to make a point, right? And so always, you've got to just be really, really careful and honest when you're doing data visualization. This was a really interesting example that a correction was run for, and it's a good story, but the problem was, so what they were doing was they were looking at kidnappings in, I think I'm right, yeah, it was kidnappings in, I believe, Nigeria. I'm pretty sure Nigeria, back during the Boko Haram stuff. And what they were doing was showing the increasing number of kidnappings over time, which is fine, but what they didn't acknowledge in the story was that the source was news reports. And the problem is, what happens once kidnapping starts to become a thing, what do reporters start doing? Reporting every single incident of kidnapping that they hear about. You know how that is. Suddenly something's in the news a lot for a little while because it's something we're paying attention to, and then we stop paying attention to it. So you couldn't really say that the number of kidnappings had increased because you didn't know if that was true. The number of kidnappings reported in the media had increased, and that's not necessarily the same thing. So you have to think about what your data source is and just be honest. Not that this wasn't trying to be dishonest, but let people know, again, it shows what you know and what you don't know. And lastly, for the love of God, you can tell people too much. And this actually, I found this, and where I found this actually was on the cover of a class about doing data visualization. But no, you can tell people too much. So simplify, simplify, simplify.
And this goes back to what I was talking about. Let go of your gems. Like, you have to do those small, too much detail can be too much.
So we have some examples, but I'm also hoping, we'll run through a few real quick, but then I'm hoping if any of you guys have done any data work, what we can do is we can just show it and you could talk a little bit about it, because that would be more awesome than us doing it. But just a couple of quick examples. These are some story examples some of the things I like about these are that they find data in unexpected ways. This is a project that Reuters did a couple of years ago called the Child Exchange. If you never saw it, it's worth checking out. But what it has to do with adoptions, and it's this issue I didn't even know existed, where in the U.S., if you're going to adopt a baby, and these were adoptions of babies from other countries, it can take a long time. The process you have to go through is very, very diligent. They're very, very, very careful about where a baby can be placed for very obvious reasons, right? But it turns out that some people who adopt kids get the kids and realize that they didn't so much want to be parents after all, right? And so I never thought about it, but I thought what you do when that happens is you raise the child, But it turns out that there's more people than you'd like to think decide that that's not what they're going to do, and they kind of re-gift the kid to somebody else. And there's no data, there's no tracking of this because it's an underground market. But what the reporters heard was that there are these forums online where these sorts of exchanges take place. So the Reuters journalists found one of these exchanges on Yahoo. They joined it publicly saying who they were. Then they scraped the entries on that website over a period of time and used the database that they built from this public source to look up the people, to investigate who was involved, to see who was getting the kids, and they found some chilling stuff, like convicted pedophiles were getting children on this list. Horrifying stuff, completely unregulated by the government. And it's a story that by its very definition there's no official database for, because it's something that's happening in the underground economy, for lack of a better way to put it. So always think creatively about what's out there, and is there a way that I can use what's out there to create what I need if it doesn't already exist? This is another really cool way of thinking about using data. This story was maybe 3 or 4 years ago by a newspaper in Florida in the U.S. And what the deal is, and it's another one of these cases of when you observe something, think about, is there a way to prove it? The car that you see in the bottom right of that screen was hit by a speeding police officer. Obviously, the people in it did not survive. And there had been a couple of cases in a short period of time, where police officers killed citizens because they were driving too fast. And as you might imagine, what happened to the police officers? Nothing, because they're police officers. And that got people in the newsroom to thinking about how often they would drive and see cops speeding without their lights on, without their sirens on, but just driving what seemed to be way too fast, with at least no apparent indication that they were on the way to anywhere official. But they're thinking again, how are you ever going to, there can't be a database for that. There is no database. But then they thought about, well, how could you prove this? And in this part of Florida, there are a lot of toll roads, right? Roads where you have to pay to drive on the road. And if you're an official vehicle, you have like some sort of sensor in your car, so when you drive through the toll, it just ticks and you don't have to stop and you don't have to pay. Well, what the journalists realized was that's creating a database. Every time a car goes through that thing and a computer registers the car was there, somewhere it's getting entered in the database and saying Officer Horvit went through here, no charge. So they requested all of that data on all of the public vehicles that were going through these toll roads, and then they got in their own car with a smartphone using the GPS and measured the distance from toll booth to toll booth, right? So now what do you have? I have the distance from toll booth A to toll booth B to toll booth C, and I have the data showing that Officer Horvit was at toll booth A at this time, toll booth B at this time, toll booth C at this time. Then they just did math, and they were able to figure out how fast I was driving. And they were able to show how many police officers were driving well over 100 miles an hour. I don't know how many kilometers that is, but it's a lot. And then there's other records that could show that they weren't on the way to any sort of emergency. Fantastic way to think about using data. And in fact, such a fantastic way that after the story ran, the chief of police came to the newspaper. They thought he was there to file a complaint. He showed up to ask them how they did it so he could use their methodology to police his own police, which is pretty cool. This is something that The Guardian is doing, and I think it's an interesting case because it's fascinating, and also it shows how you can run into trouble if you're not super careful with good ideas. And not that they've run into any trouble, that is not what I'm saying. But this is a project that's ongoing called The Counted, which they're doing to count the number of police shootings in the U.S. because there is no good official data in the U.S. on the number of times that police officers shoot people, because why on earth would you want to know that, right? Well, you'd want to know that. So The Guardian started this thing they're doing that they're crowdsourcing, which they're doing by people can call in tips. They're looking for reports in news organizations around our country, and they're creating a database that you can click through and look at of every time a police officer that they can document shoots an individual. It's awesome, and they give you a very specific number with that counter. And I think this is a great project and really exciting, but you can also think how careful you'd have to be doing a project like this. First of all, you have to make sure that you really vet every single report that comes in. What if somebody reports a police shooting in the paper and a week later they have to run a correction because they had the wrong number or there was something else that was wrong? How are you going to look for that sort of stuff? Whenever you use a really specific number like this, you do have to be really careful to be very honest and clear, and they are, about where the data is coming from, because the more specific the number you use in a story or a graphic, the more you're saying this is a definitive number. So I think it's a really, really worthwhile and cool project, but it's also something where you've got to think it through and think of all the ways you need to be clear and honest and upfront with your audience so they understand what you're giving them and what you're not.
So this is done by a bunch of journalists from a couple different news organizations in Brazil. And so they call it the Secret Diaries. But this is where these journalists got together, had never done data journalism before. And what was really fascinating is the time they took. If you're going to build your own database, there's a lot of methodology and conversations you should have before you ever actually go and build it. And so they built, there was no database on basically the assembly or parliament's actions, whether it came to spending, whether it came to salaries. And so they took these paper diaries, is what they call them, and put them and actually created a database. But they were very careful, very methodical, because they had 5 journalists inputting all this data into a spreadsheet, that they had a very lengthy Word document of this means this, and this is how you input it. Just like we were talking about a database manual, that's what they had. So I highly recommend that if you're going to build your own data, this is not something you do on a whim, that you put together a methodology that you and your fellow coworkers can follow, or you can follow when you pick it up next week.
And with cool tools like Google Docs and everything, this has gotten so much easier to do because sharing files is now so easy. It's way easier than it used to be. Yeah. Why don't we do one more and then we'll ask.
Okay. This is fatal extraction. This was done by several news organizations in Africa, but they looked at the Australian mining empire. Let's see what I hyperlinked here. And so, what's well known is about China's mining industry in Africa, but Australia actually has the largest. And so they took 13 different countries they looked at and actually used 13 different reporters. So they did everything from fatalities, injuries, taking over land grabs, and basically the impact of mining and throughout the continent of Africa. So a lot of different data components. They did do some scraping, they did some coding, and really some progressive analysis that way.
So does anybody have, if we have anybody in the room who's done some data work, we would love it if you would talk, we'd love to show something and have you talk about what you've done instead of having us talk about stuff. Do we have anybody who would like to volunteer?
Or any questions?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, we'd like to pull it up. Yes, that's what we'd like. Exactly. Yep. Come on up. Come on up.
And then we'll
Grab
have any
the mic.
questions, yeah.
Wait. We'll use this one. We're going to use every mic they have before we're done here. That's on. Okay. Or you can just, if you just want to sit and drive.
Yeah, I'm just going to show you the project first.
Sure.
Can I just get out and go out?
You can do anything you like.
Yep.
You have complete power. It's also not my computer.
I'm not sure. I have to look it up.
While we're waiting, is there any questions? We covered everything.
Yes. Awesome.
Yeah, I'll find it.
Got it?
Yep.
Okay, great. All right, so if you want to tell us what we're looking at.
Yeah. So in Norway, we haven't had proper defaulters list, people who can't pay their bills and are defaulted. So we have had total numbers for states and some counties, and it's been very random. So the thing is that we didn't quite know what was happening in the different, especially the different counties. So what we did was that the special thing about this case was that there were only commercial companies who had this data, because the Norwegian state doesn't collect this data. So we had to fight to get that data from a commercial company who didn't have anything to win on it to give us the data. But when we did get the data, it was quarter of a million rows of data of every Norwegian who has been defaulted at a certain point of time. And we made this. Yeah. Oh. So what we did here is that we made this interactive thing, which which shows how much the total number of the value of the default value, and how many in each county, which gender they had, what is their age, and the 10 most defaulted counties, the 10 with the best defaulting rate. And we made a lot of stories about this afterwards, because there were a lot of things that we didn't know about prior to this. So it was a fun project to do, but I do certainly recognize that feeling of checking it umpteenth times to be sure that you haven't missed anything. So, yeah.
Thank you very much. And just someone else had raised.
Yeah.
Thanks. Well, yeah, come on up. Come on down. Yeah, please do.
So
you can use this one.
we had a little project inspired by some Swedish friends. Where's the? Oh, yeah. I don't know where this is here. About interest rates, because we had a lot of banks saying this is our lowest interest rate, and it turned out not to be true. And we basically just asked people to send us their interest rate. The first version was a Google form, so we set it up during 2 hours when we had a story about how the banks were making a lot of money, and this kind of inspired people to actually send it to us. We had 2,000 reports with how much they had borrowed, the value of their house, email addresses, some stories from many of them. And after a while, we made in this little thing here. You can see if you say your interest rate is 3.1, which is pretty bad in Norway right now, and you borrowed 2 million kroners, for instance. You see this little thing here shows up, says, well, it's actually, no, that can't be true. This is 200,000 kroners, then it's a good interest rate. But if you see the difference, if you borrowed more money, you actually get a better interest rate, and this is then it's very bad compared to that. If you fill in the whole thing, you get a report saying you could probably save so and so much money if you get really good interest rates. And some of the banks, at least, they stopped saying this is our best interest rate. Like the biggest Norwegian bank, we had 800 reports on them in a short while, and 600 were below their official lowest interest rate if you were a premium customer. So we had I think we had like 4 or 5 front pages on this since the spring, and one of the great experiences was actually just to have an open field where we said, tell us your story about your interest rate, and we've been able to pull in a lot of good stories that way, because most people don't write anything, but some people write fantastic stuff.
This is great. Is there a discussion about how long you'll keep this going and maintaining it?
We have to do some more work to keep. We hope to keep it going, because the problem is that every time the central bank changes the interest rate, this data becomes kind of old. But we have this field here. If you fill in the whole thing, you're asked if you would like to be kept updated and also help us update it. So most people say yes. So I hope we can sort of get them back.
Thank you.
That's awesome. Thanks.
What was the?
The question was, what was the reaction of the banks to the project?
The reaction of the banks, I mean, they have to answer our questions mostly. And I don't think they necessarily liked it. Some of them have been quite uncomfortable because suddenly we know more about their customers than they like. So I've had some suddenly you discover that they're not necessarily telling the whole truth.
But no one disputed the results.
Well, some of them have been trying to say this to some of their customers. We know that, and we probably have to ask them about it and then show them the data, because the data is actually really good. I mean, we have a few cases where someone has obviously, put in the wrong stuff, but it's very rare. We ask for the email address of everyone now, so you can. Yeah. It seems likely that it's okay, and every time we've called someone, because it checks out when their stories check out. So,
thanks very much. We can do another. If somebody else, we have time for one more. Yep, I think so. Yes, right there. Come on down.
What prize do you have when they come down?
I have the prize of fame, love of your fellow journalists, and respect of your peers.
Well, I can't be worse than my other Norwegian colleagues, so I'll have to make a contribution. These other guys presented stuff they made themselves. I wasn't involved in making this, but my colleagues in DocumentCloud did. And it's transferable to other countries as well. And what we did was to try to see if we could make a systematic approach to the quality of living in different Norwegian municipalities. So we would need comparable data that could be used across all these different municipalities. It's produced, Norway's a fairly small country with a strong government, so lots and lots of data is made by everything from NGOs to obviously the government itself, and by the different municipalities. There should be a map coming up here. Probably will. So it's called the sort of directly translated Stockist Change of Municipalities, which is our municipality rating. Here we go. And so this is Norway here. And we could basically just click a municipality and you'll get a dice with a rating from 1 to 6 on the different qualities of public welfare, for example. So in Folldal, a very small municipality in Norway, they have the value of 3 concerning school systems. Obviously, you'll ask, so what are the criteria? We had to pull together a lot of data from different databases, and of course, look for the quality in this. Is it comparable? Can we use it? And we only went for what we felt sure could be used. It's also called KOSTRA, for those who know this, who are Norwegians here. It's the commune sector internal numbers that we would use. And you could go and check out this commune and see, all the different indicators on the standard of living. This poor guy here is the mayor of Svelvik, which is titled Norway's worst municipality. And he had then to give an interview about how it felt to be the... I'm sorry, man. Beautiful place, though. I mean, just by the waterfront. And there's even a marina in the middle of the city here, it looks nice. But I don't think the schools are very good. You could then sort of best health care, best financial control, best place to work, quality of kindergartens, you name it. So if you're living in any country that produces statistics, then this is the way to be using it. Simply Google Maps, which is in the bottom here, and running the whole thing.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right. We are out of time, so thanks so much, everybody. And if you need any of the stuff we talked about, just shoot me an email, and we will share. And thanks to everybody who came up and shared your stories. Thanks so much.
Thank you.